All right, so let's dive into a story that I think you'll find both fascinating and unsettling. We're talking about the Waco siege, a tragedy that unfolded in 1993. Even if you weren't around back then, that image of the compound engulfed in flames is probably something you've seen. It's a moment that continues to raise a lot of questions, not just about what happened, but about religious extremism, government overreach, and how those forces collided in such a devastating way.
Yeah, and it's a story with deep roots, going back much further than many people realize.
That's what's so crazy about this one.
Our source material for this deep dive is an episode of American History Hit featuring Jeff Gwyn, who wrote the book Waco, David Koresh, The Branch Davidians, and A Legacy of Rage.
Oh, wow.
We'll be using his insights to explore not just the events themselves, but the historical context and the lasting impact of Waco.
So where do we even begin with something as complex as Waco?
Well, you might be surprised to learn that the origins of the Branch Davidians can be traced back to the 1840s. With a preacher named William Miller, he believed he'd cracked the code of the Bible and predicted the world would end in 1844.
And I'm guessing he was wrong.
He was. But even though his predictions didn't pan out, he had sparked a movement. His followers, known as the Millerites, really believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible, especially the book of Revelation. And that's important because it set the stage for a whole series of offshoot groups.
So we're talking about a lineage of apocalyptic belief that ultimately led to the Branch Davidians in Waco.
Exactly. And one of the key figures in that lineage was Victor Houteff, a man who went from selling washing machines to claiming he understood the true meaning of the Bible.
Wow.
He formed his own group, which eventually settled in Waco, Texas. They believed it would be their sanctuary when the death angels came to cleanse the world, an idea rooted in their interpretation of biblical prophecies.
And this group, with its belief in an impending apocalypse, became the foundation for what David Koresh would later lead.
Yes, but Koresh wasn't always the leader. He came onto the scene a bit later. In fact, he started out as Vernon Howell, a young man described as fairly unremarkable in his early years. What's fascinating is how he transformed himself into a messianic figure, taking on the name David Koresh and claiming to be the reincarnation of King Cyrus and the Lamb of God.
That's quite a leap. How did he manage to convince people of that?
It was a combination of charisma and his interpretations of the Bible, particularly the book of Revelation. He twisted verses about the Lamb of God and the Battle of Armageddon to position himself as the chosen one, the only one who could guide his followers through the coming apocalypse. This gave him incredible control over the group, justifying his demands for absolute obedience. He even went so far as to force the men into celibacy while taking multiple wives himself, including underage girls, all under the guise of fulfilling biblical prophecy.
That's incredibly disturbing. And all of this was happening within a community that already believed the end of the world was imminent.
Right. That sense of urgency and fear played a significant role in the group's dynamics. They were preparing for a final battle, and they saw the government, particularly with its focus on gun control in the early 90s, as part of the forces they would have to fight against.
So their stockpiling of weapons wasn't just about self-defense, but about fulfilling their apocalyptic prophecies.
Exactly. They saw themselves as warriors engaged in a spiritual battle, and Koresh used that to solidify his authority and control.
Which brings us to the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They were the ones who first took notice of the Branch Davidians' activities, specifically their illegal conversion and sale of automatic weapons, right?
That's right. And it's important to understand the context here. The ATF was facing internal pressure, there was talk of the agency being disbanded, and they were eager to prove their worth. So when they received a tip about illegal weapons at Mount Carmel, they saw it as a chance to make a big statement.
But their investigation, and especially the initial raid on the compound, were deeply flawed.
Yes. It seems they underestimated the Branch Davidians' resolve and preparedness. They also failed to grasp the depth of their beliefs, assuming they could easily take them by surprise. And of course, things went terribly wrong. The raid turned into a shootout, leaving 4 ATF agents and 6 Davidians dead.
A tragic start to what would become a 51-day siege, a standoff that captivated the nation, and raised serious questions about the use of force in law enforcement. But how did we go from a botched raid to a full-blown siege?
Well, after the initial shootout, the FBI took over. And remember, this is a time when 24-hour news coverage was becoming the norm. The media attention on Waco was intense, putting immense pressure on the government to resolve the situation.
So you have the Branch Davidians convinced they're in a divinely ordained battle holed up in their compound. And you have the FBI facing intense scrutiny and determined to bring the siege to an end. It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was, and things only escalated from there. The FBI brought in tanks, armored vehicles, hundreds of agents. It was a massive show of force that only solidified the Branch Davidians' belief that they were fighting a righteous battle against a tyrannical government.
Okay, so we've got this incredible standoff. The ATF raid has failed. The FBI is now in charge. And the whole world is watching. But how did we get to that final tragic assault?
That's where things get even more complicated. There were attempts at negotiation, but the situation was incredibly tense. David Koresh, despite promising to surrender after broadcasting a message about the Seven Seals, a key concept in the Book of Revelation, ended up delivering a rambling, incoherent message. That only fueled the FBI's belief that a peaceful resolution was unlikely.
So their hopes for a peaceful resolution were dashed, and the pressure to act was mounting. That must have put the FBI in an incredibly difficult position. What happened next? It really does sound like there was no good way out at that point. What were the FBI's options?
Well, they were in a tough spot, They felt they'd exhausted negotiation attempts, and there was concern about the safety of the hostages, the children inside the compound. Plus, the public was growing increasingly impatient for a resolution.
So what did they do?
They ultimately decided to use tear gas to try and force the Branch Davidians out, say. They assured the Attorney General, Janet Reno, that it would be non-lethal.
But as we know, the compound went up in flames. What happened? Did something go wrong with the tear gas?
That's the question that's been debated ever since. The compound was engulfed in a massive fire, and 76 Branch Davidians, including 25 children, died. The images of the inferno are truly horrifying.
So what caused the fire? Was it the tear gas or did something else happen?
There are a few theories, and the truth is it's hard to say for sure. One possibility is that the tear gas itself, even though it was supposed to be non-lethal, somehow ignited the fire. It turns out the FBI did use a small number of combustible tear gas canisters, despite their initial assurances.
So it's possible that those canisters in the chaos of the assault accidentally started the blaze.
That's one possibility. Another theory is that the fire was started by the Branch Davidians themselves, either accidentally or intentionally. Remember, they were living in a fairly rudimentary structure, using things like kerosene lanterns for light.
So an accident could have happened easily, especially in the midst of all the commotion and fear. But you said intentionally. Are you saying they might have set the fire themselves?
Some people believe that's a possibility. Some of the survivors have claimed that Koresh had spoken about a fiery end as a pathway to salvation. It's a chilling thought, but it's important to remember that we're talking about a group deeply immersed in apocalyptic beliefs.
Wow, so we have these three possible explanations. A tear gas accident, an accidental fire started by the Branch Davidians themselves, or a deliberate act of self-immolation. It's a lot to grapple with.
It is. And the fact that we may never know for certain what caused the fire has only fueled conspiracy theories and distrust of the government's account of what happened.
It's understandable that people would question the official narrative, especially given the tragic loss of life and the government's missteps throughout the entire ordeal.
Absolutely. And that's part of what makes the legacy of Waco so complex and controversial. It became a rallying point for anti-government groups who saw it as proof that the government was willing to use excessive force against its own citizens.
Right, and just 2 years later, we had the Oklahoma City bombing, which was directly linked to Waco Dana. Timothy McVeigh, the perpetrator of that horrific attack, had actually been present at Waco during the siege and cited it as a key motivation for his actions.
It's a chilling reminder of how Waco became a symbol not just of government overreach, but of a perceived need for violent resistance. It fed into a narrative of distrust and resentment that had devastating consequences.
It's heartbreaking to think that those who died at Waco and the survivors who carry those scars became part of a story that led to even more violence and loss.
And it raises important questions about how we as a society deal with groups that hold beliefs outside the mainstream, especially when those beliefs lead to potentially dangerous actions. How do we balance the need for security with the right to religious freedom? How do we engage in dialogue without resorting to force?
These are really tough questions, and I don't think there are easy answers. But it seems like the events at Waco highlight the dangers of failing to understand and empathize with those who see the world differently than we do.
I agree. And it also underscores the importance of clear communication, transparency, and accountability, especially when it comes to the actions of government agencies. The lack of those things at Waco contributed to the tragedy and fueled the distrust that followed.
So where do we go from here? What can we learn from Waco, both about the past and about the challenges we face today?
Yeah, it's a really tough question, and I don't think there are easy answers. But looking back at Waco, is there anything that stands out to you as particularly crucial, something that might have led to a different outcome? You know what strikes me is how much miscommunication and misunderstanding there was on both sides. The government agencies involved, particularly the ATF, seem to have a very limited understanding of the Branch Davidians' worldview. They underestimated the power of their apocalyptic beliefs and their willingness to fight, even die for what they saw as a righteous cause.
It's almost as if they were operating in completely different realities.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that disconnect led to a series of missteps. The initial raid, the prolonged siege, the use of tear gas. Each decision seemed to escalate the situation, pushing both sides further into a corner, making a peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely.
It's easy to look back and say, well, they should have done this or they shouldn't have done that. Yeah. But in the heat of the moment with the pressure they were under, it must have been incredibly difficult to make the right call.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to remember that even the Branch Davidians, despite their extreme beliefs and their leaders' manipulative tactics, were ultimately driven by a desire for something that many people seek, a sense of meaning, purpose, and belonging. They believed they were part of something bigger than themselves, something that would ultimately redeem them.
So even though their actions were destructive and harmful, their motivations, at least in their minds, were rooted in a yearning for something positive, a connection to the divine.
Precisely, and I think that's a crucial point to consider when we think about Waco. It reminds us that even the most misguided beliefs can hold immense power over people shaping their choices and their actions. It's a reminder that empathy and understanding are essential, even when dealing with groups whose beliefs we may find repugnant or dangerous.
If we step back and consider the bigger picture here, what lessons can we draw from Waco that might help us navigate similar situations today? I mean, we're living in a time of increased polarization with people retreating into their own echo chambers, often demonizing those who hold different views.
Yeah, it's a worrying trend, and Waco serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of allowing those divisions to fester. It highlights the need for open dialogue, for trying to understand where others are coming from, even if we disagree with their perspectives.
You're saying that communication is key, especially in situations where emotions are running high, where there's a potential for conflict.
Exactly. And it's not just about communication between individuals, it's about transparency and accountability, especially when it comes to those in positions of power. The lack of those things at Waco contributed to the tragedy and fueled the distrust that followed.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Waco siege, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to take away from this story?
I think it's this: Waco was a tragedy on multiple levels: the loss of innocent lives, the erosion of public trust, the rise of anti government sentiment. It's a story that should compel us to reflect on our own beliefs, our willingness to understand those who differ from us, and our commitment to peaceful resolution, even in the face of profound disagreement.
It's a challenging task, but an essential one if we want to create a more just and compassionate world. So, as you continue to think about the Waco siege and its legacy, consider this. Could a deeper understanding of the Branch Davidians' worldview, however warped it may have been, have led to a different outcome? Could a more nuanced approach, one that prioritized dialogue and de-escalation, have prevented this tragedy? It's a question worth pondering, not just for historical understanding, but for how we navigate the complex challenges we face today.